Hello and welcome to Point Counterpoint. With the polarizing environment we live in today, the goal is to present how both sides of an argument are wrong or right, and break through the noise that tries to convince us all that one side is pure evil and the other side is heaven on earth. Today's video will break down how and why we've become so divided in America as a society, and how those in power on both sides of the political spectrum are the architects of it all. Yes, indeed, they not only understand why we're so divided, but they encourage it for one simple reason: to maintain power. To understand how we got to where we are today, we must understand the problems those in power faced and how they solved it. This problem first presented itself during the period after World War I and before World War II, which is also called the interbellum period. This period in the United States became a turbulent and relatively lawless situation. The failed policy of prohibition, which gave rise to organized crime and a spike in violence, along with significant increases in racial hate crimes, gave a challenge for governments at all levels to maintain order during the Roaring '20s and the crushing impact of the Great Depression. The problem of an unruly population didn't resolve itself until the outbreak of World War II. So why was World War II good for those in power? Because it gave the US population a big problem to focus on. During the conflict, crimes such as homicides and robbery steadily decreased as everyone answered the call to support the war effort. What you may not know is that the US population were not interested in getting involved in World War II, with it seen as a European problem. For 3 years, Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa fought against each other, while the US was protected by the vast oceans of the Atlantic and Pacific. What many don't know is the significant evidence that the US government knew there was an attack coming and did little to nothing to prevent it. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt was a huge proponent for joining the war, but faced the problem of how does one get the entire US population to dramatically shift their opinions and support war? Well, an attack on US soil is one way. Over a year before the attack on Pearl Harbor, recommendations were made in a memo by Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCallum, which outlined an 8-part plan to provoke an attack by Japan and bring the US into the war. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, US intelligence services intercepted and decrypted 14 messages between Japanese government officials, giving significant information of an impending attack on America. Additionally, a full 3 days before the attack, US naval intelligence provided a memo to the White House, sounding alarms regarding Japan's interest in Hawaii, and yet nothing was done. The attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, damaging or sinking 21 ships with 2,403 people killed, including 63 civilians. Then, as Admiral Yamamoto of the Japanese Navy said, the sleeping dragon of US industrial power roared to life. 4 years later, with over 405,000 US soldiers and sailors killed, World War II was won by the Allies, and US patriotism was at an all-time high. However, the great problem for those in power presented itself again. That issue, simply put, what big problem do we give the US population to focus on so we can use our power and rule without them knowing what we're doing? Up to this point, the Democrats oversaw the government, pulling the strings to keep the population distracted. However, it soon became the Republicans' turn. After the war, Russia, one of our greatest allies, entered a period called the Soviet expansionism. What we now call the ideological divide pitted the US and Western world with capitalism against the Soviet Union with communism. This anti-communism movement culminated in the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, in a period often called McCarthyism, named after a Republican senator named Joseph McCarthy, with President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was also a Republican, in the White House. This period gave birth to a strategy of keeping the population in line by means that were slightly less violent, longer-lasting, and far more effective than open war. Simply put, keep the population scared of the big bad Russians and we'll rule with impunity. The Cold War was a golden age for government power and spending. With the US population distracted, the Republicans increased military spending to 52% of the country's GDP, and the Democrats increased spending on social programs by over 500%, beginning the run on what has now become the insurmountable national debt we have today. This golden age came to an end in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those in power for the first time in half a century were confronted with the big problem of a population without a scary enemy to hate. They did their best to fill the void by stoking fears and hatred for other countries like China and North Korea, but it didn't have the same massive impact as the USSR did. Then, there was the moment which would change everything. The general population doesn't know who it was or what group it was, but a decision was made that while war was a good distraction, the death and harm was unacceptable. The Cold War lasted a half-century, but relying on other countries to be a distraction was too unpredictable. So the best option was to divide the population and have the two sides villainize each other. That strategy has the potential for a more reliable distraction that could last indefinitely. As a result, a coordinated effort to repeal important safeguards to ensure fair and balanced journalism occurred in the early 2000s. This included the FCC repealing the Fairness Doctrine and other regulations, which ensured the ethical reporting of current events for over 6 decades, clearing the way for partisan agencies like Fox News and CNBC to spin current events as much as they wanted, to fit whatever narrative needed to accomplish the ultimate goal of extreme bipartisanism. We now live in a country where half of the population truly consider the other half the enemy. With intent, the two parties' goal is to point fingers at each other. Republicans accusing the Democrats of ruining the country, the Democrats doing the same of the Republicans. However, here is a question we all need to ask ourselves. If these two parties who rule our lives wanted to heal the division we currently have, why wouldn't one or both restore the Fairness Doctrine Act and other regulations which required fair and balanced journalism? It's been almost 20 years, and neither side is truly trying to fix it. In conclusion, those in power have us right where they want us, so distracted by hating each other that we don't really pay attention to our freedoms being eroded. And sometimes we even call for those freedoms to be taken away from us. Make no mistake, both sides are doing this. Until we realize we are not each other's enemies and accept that we don't have to agree on everything, they will continue to push us left and right like sheep in the field, with their sheepdogs, Fox News, CNBC, and other partisan organizations telling us where to go and what to think. There is far more that unites us than divides us.